So that is the basic structure. The Information and Broadcasting Ministry, in theory, does have the power to take channels, yank channels off the air, but it does that only for entertainment channels, or it just for political reasons and for reasons of power of the media and the media's ability to trash reputations and to destroy careers. News channels are never touched by the Information and Broadcasting Ministry. So briefly, that's the situation.
So you could, for what would an entertainment channel be pulled off?
For issues around the watershed. There's a channel called FTV, Fashion TV. They were pulled off for a few months at a time, or a few weeks at a time, several times for nudity on screen.
And yet a news channel can show a minister and his mistress.
That's right.
How bizarre.
Yes.
Right,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
Well, in Australia, the situation is similar for the print media, as I think it is here, and in that the print media have always been self-regulating. They've never been subject to government control except in times of war, national emergency, but they are, of course, subject to the laws of the land. The Australian Press Council is owned and operated by proprietors and publishers. On the council are some members of the public and I think one journalist as well. It's run by a small office on a very modest budget. A major drawback to this, as with other forms of self-regulation, is that the Press Council has no power to enforce its findings on its members. If it upholds a complaint from a member of the public, it can ask the offending, and it will ask the offending paper to publish a retraction or an apology. And this is honoured more in the breach than anything else, because routinely, if it's done at all, it's done in some obscure corner of the paper as briefly as possible. And on occasion, editors who've disagreed with the ruling simply ignore it. Moreover, any member organisation can just withdraw its support, including its financial support as well as its membership, from the Press Council. News Limited has done this on a notorious occasion where an editor refused to publish, not only refused to publish a retraction, but News Limited then withdrew from the Press Council for some months. I think the other interesting factor too is that the recommendations of the government's inquiry into media regulation has so united the press that it's strengthened the Press Council as never before. By coincidence, the Press Council acquired a new chairman, a man with a very strong reputation for ethical behaviour, a man called Julian Disney, just before this whole Finkelstein inquiry was launched. And of course, as soon as the findings were announced, which, as I say, advocate in effect a statutory body to give the Press Council teeth, Disney was able to persuade Fairfax Media and News Limited to guarantee their funding, to increase their funding and guarantee their funding to the Press Council for several years at a time in cycles. So that was the first kind of certainty that the Press Council had about its funding, and the first level of sort of adequate funding it had had in many, many years. Now the irony is, and what demonstrates still the weakness of the self-regulatory approach, is at the same time Fairfax and News agreed to do this, West Australian newspapers took their bat and ball and went home. They said, no, we're not going to be part of this anymore at all. So they've withdrawn their support. So, in effect, nobody's regulating them. They really are regulating themselves. So there are, there are real problems with this. By contrast, broadcast media in Australia have been subject to government control from their very beginnings. And this is partly because, broadcast spectrum was seen as scarce, and partly because broadcast media was seen as powerful. Initially, the control was very prescriptive, but over time, regulation has become increasingly light touch, and it's progressively introduced more elements of industry self-regulation. The regulatory body today is called the Australian Communications and Media Authority. It covers all broadcast media, some broadband internet services, and in fact, some magazine and online services as well. when it was set up, it required each industry sector, so commercial radio, commercial television, and the public service broadcasters, that's the Australian Broadcasting Corporation and the Special Broadcasting Service, which is a multi-language service, to write and register with them a code of practice. Well, this was fairly straightforward for the ABC and SBS, who already had their editorial codes. The commercial radio group got together and wrote one for themselves, and similarly the commercial television group. In addition to this, the ACMA sets rules relating to matters of response to complaints, taste and decency, and some Australian content requirements still. Now, it does ultimately have the power to revoke a broadcast licence. In practice, it has never come anywhere near doing this, and it is sometimes accused of being almost as toothless as the Press Council. It has levied fines on individual broadcasters who've committed... well, we had a scandal a while back called Cash for Comment, where it was discovered that some very prominent and nationally known radio hosts, whose programmes were syndicated around the country, were taking money directly from, in one case, a banking body. This particular man had been very critical of the banks and the way they were treating consumers. And then, almost without warning, his message began to change. He started to say, oh, well, you know, it appears there are things that I didn't understand, and so on and so forth. Because the Australian Banking Association got in touch with him and, you know, said, you know, there's information you need, and oh, by the way, would you like a retainer? And he took it. And then another radio host was discovered to have a similar arrangement with a very large property developer. And he was almost shamelessly spruiking a new development in Sydney, and turned out to have been more or less given a multi-million-dollar waterfront apartment by this group. So that was seen as going a little too far, and they were fined. And the problem that the commercial radio proprietors claimed was, you know, we have live reads, we have advertising. I mean, obviously our hosts sometimes are paid to read these ads as if they were their own view, and so on and so forth. So, in a very amusing outcome, the authority required this particular media organisation to give some signal whenever the presenter was talking about a company or group with whom he had a financial arrangement. And he was so scornful of this ruling that he decided to use a cowbell. So every time he was about to, you know, advertise on air or read an advertisement for an organisation he had some kind of financial dealings with, you'd hear this dang, 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 you know, from this cowbell before it came on. And he entertained himself with that for quite a long time. But I would say that there's long been broad recognition in the community that news media regulation in Australia is inconsistent, it's fragmented, and largely ineffective. And given the technological change that sees media increasingly moving across platforms, the phenomenon of convergence, there really isn't any good reason now to have one body regulating newspapers and another news and current affairs programmes on radio and television, and to an extent magazine and online. And that's the argument that was made by the Finkelstein report in their recommendation.
Sachi, I just want to pick up with you the idea there of the radio presenter being paid by the bank. I think in India it actually works in a slightly different way, corruption, doesn't it?
Well, if you were to look at, for instance, the terms of reference of the LEVESON inquiry, people in India would say it's entirely inadequate, because it's not only the politicians, of course you have the police here, it's not only the politicians who are a problem, it's the interests of big business. Big business is a huge encroacher into the news space in India. There's also there are a huge number of owner editors or proprietor editors in India, both in television and in newspapers. Many of the editors either own their newspapers or are major shareholders. So the firewall between the editorial function and the commercial function has been almost entirely dissolved. So everything is, all news decisions are taken at least partly with an eye on the commercial impact of that news. Corruption in India works in terms of influence by the owners. There's also outright sale of the news space to advertisers.
Mm-hmm.
And one recent scandal at the end of 2009 was about the sale of the news space to political advertisers for political campaigning without declaring it as advertising. So this for a large democracy like India, where we are proud of being the largest democracy in the world, this obviously has grave implications.
There are also issues of the journalists actually seeking payment not to write about people. Isn't this another
a bit of blackmail? Yes, that's more at the lower. The lesser paid journalists in far-flung rural areas will often barter news or non-news for money, but I think financial journalism in India, except for one notable exception, is almost entirely compromised.
Really?
It's PR-led, corporate-led. The Times of India started a wonderful exercise about 7 years ago. They called it private treaties. They took shares in companies in exchange for advertising space. So they became shareholders in the company for 20,000 column centimeters or whatever of advertising space. So becoming shareholders in the company, they were financially, in self-interest, they were obliged to prop up the company, and this encroached into editorial decisions, and this is documented. So with that episode about 8 years ago, and in the last 4 years, there's been a lot more attacks on the practices of the press, the unethical practices. I mean, lest I convey the wrong impression, the Indian media, both newspapers and television, also do perform a lot of public service work, but often in the wrong way. They often campaign for justice, they take up campaigns, but then they conduct media trials. So there's a plus and a minus to everything, but there's a lot of public interest work going on at the same time. But anyway, for the last 4 years, there's been a lot of pressure on the practices of newspapers, which is why I said the LEVESON inquiry, or the outcome of it, might have some relevance in India. It began with the Mumbai terrorist attack at the end of 2008, where television channels were talking to hostages inside the hotel, and including asking them their whereabouts. And this was monitored by handlers of the terrorists in Pakistan, live on air. So they were telling their people, right, we just saw on this channel, there are 4 guys hiding behind the ballroom in the hotel. Go and get them. So there was a loss of lives. They were telecasting operations and commandos landing on the roof live, again, which the terrorists inside the hotel couldn't see it, but the handlers could see it on television and pass the information on. So there was a lot of brouhaha about that. Next, in 2009, came along this paid political news business, which again acted as some kind of a pressure point on media practices. There was, as far as paid political news goes, the Election Commission of India, rather than any regulatory body or self-regulatory body, has been the biggest mover. So you have an external player coming into the situation, looking at the use of paid political news from the point of elections and cracking down on the misuse of media. Then you have, last year in 2011, you had what was called the Radia tapes, a corporate lobbyist. There were recordings of her phone conversations that were leaked to the press, which the media refused to use for a long time. She's talking to about the conversations with about 20 different journalists about money, about pushing corporate agenda, and about getting top journalists to lobby for particular people to be given a particular portfolio, to become the telecom minister.